Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Folks are still coming in, but we want to make sure that we make the best use of our time today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off. This is Finding the Balance, Optimizing Privacy, Data Security, and Personalization. So if this is the session you were looking for, welcome. If not, you may want to try again. I'm very excited to be able to introduce to you today our two speakers. This will be a conversation format with Mimi and Lisa, so there will not be a PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint-free zone, so hopefully that will appeal to you right about now. Our first speaker will be Lisa Yannicki Hinchliffe. She is Professor Coordinator for Information Literacy Services and Instruction at the University Library and affiliate faculty at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. As 2010-2011 ACRL President, she led the launch of the ACRL Value of Academic Libraries initiative. Lisa is currently editor of Library Trends, a chef at the Scholarly Kitchen, and chair of the IFLA Information Literacy section. Next up in the conversation will be Mimi Coulter. Mimi is Deputy University Librarian for Stanford Libraries, where she's responsible for operations and the implementation of strategic projects across library departments. Her areas of special focus include capital project implementation, organizational development for libraries, and copyright issues at both the library and the university level. She holds an MBA and an MLIS from Drexel University and an MA from the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a birder, which I'm very excited about, and will often be found outside the library watching whatever is flying by. She may be looking out her kitchen window while we're talking here. So I wanted to talk to you guys just for a second as to why we are presenting this session today and why I, in particular, am so excited to be participating. Privacy is certainly a timely topic. I think we probably can't go more than a day without some sort of privacy issues arising. And privacy on campus and interacting with campus resources is particularly close to my heart. I have a son who is a sophomore at the University of Maine. And as a result of his activities on campus, I've thought a lot more about data security, tracking, and the like. I'm also in the midst of editing a special issue of Serial's Librarian on the topic of privacy with Doreen Bradley from the University of Michigan Libraries. And Doreen and I are hoping to put together a proposal for the ATG series on the same topic. So if that's a topic that you are working in, little plug, reach out to me or to Doreen because we may be interested in collaborating with you on the project. A little bit about how the session is going to be organized today. Each of our speakers is going to do a brief opening statement to give you a little bit of a sense of the issues that are the most important to them. I will ask them a couple of questions after that, and then we will move to audience questions. I am told that audience questions should come in through the Pathable platform, but I'm also told that has not always been the case in previous sessions. So if you cannot figure out how to ask your question in the Pathable platform, you can put it in the chat. I'll be toggling between the two. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mimi, who's going to start with her opening statement.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. So just a little bit of background. One of my projects, one of more exciting projects for this year was developing and then publishing our Stanford Library's value statement. And I'm really happy to finally have that up. There was a fair amount of work involved, and it was really kind of good. And in all of the discussion sessions that we had bringing our library staff together, privacy was consistently raised as something critical and important to be referenced in the value statement. So we ended up with a phrase that says, "We value and protect privacy for our patrons and ourselves" in our published value statement. It seems you find similar phrases in a number of libraries' value statements, and even where libraries don't have value statements, they tend to be very proud of their, and point to their privacy policies. Almost everybody has a privacy policy, and the ALA calls out privacy as one of its core values of librarianship. They call it necessary for intellectual freedom and fundamental to the ethics and practice of librarianship. So basically, librarians are very pro-privacy in principle. The interesting experience that I'm hoping that we can talk about is understanding how to put that principle into practice, and what does it actually mean to be respecting privacy, and how do you find that balance around privacy and customization and around access and some of these other things that we're talking about. I was recently involved in a discussion at Stanford around the use of security cameras, the appropriate use of security cameras in the library, and in a library that values privacy, which I think is a great tangible example of that tension between privacy and security that we see in a number of different places. In practice, I think a lot of the privacy questions that we are looking to address tend to relate to use of materials. So libraries have historically been very protective of patrons' borrowing records and have been generally committed to ensuring anonymity in users accessing collections. The course, classic example there is the deliberate steps that libraries have taken in the wake of the Patriot Act to purge borrowing records as soon as a book is returned, so that that information can't be subpoenaed and you can't be sharing patrons' borrowing records. And I think most folks that I talk to are in favor of that policy, but it's interesting to see even there where there are challenges. A couple of years ago, I managed a review of our library systems to look at privacy concerns. And we had a big shock when we looked at ILL and our whole interlibrary loan process, because although we were regularly purging our direct borrowing, we were regularly being careful about purging the actual direct borrowing that we did, but we weren't purging anything out of ILL. So we did revise that system and make changes there to make sure we were being consistent in our practice. But it was interesting because when we went through and alerted some of our users that we were going to be purging this backlog data, we had a good handful of patrons who were using their ILL request lists, basically like a little bibliography, and that was the way they were tracking the material that they were using, and they were perfectly happy and wanted to keep it. So the expectations that librarians have are not always in line with what's going on with the patrons. And of course, now one of the challenges that I face regularly is interpreting that privacy around use of collections into a digital realm as we're looking at establishing, as we're building privacy clauses and establishing privacy policies for use of digital collections and databases and other materials that we're using. How do you do that transfer? We've had concerns come up more than once. It was a lot of those discussions that led us back in March of 2019 to publish our statement on patron privacy and database access. That was something that we kicked it off, but we had a number of collaborators, especially but not limited to our Ivy Plus colleagues, in putting that together and getting that out there and having it be and just really making a statement on how we expected privacy to work within some of these resources that we were using. We had a particular kind of kicked us off when we had two vendors in quick succession make interface changes that required us to release data that we just weren't comfortable releasing. So it really has helped to have a statement out there, to have something that our curators and our folks who are interacting with the vendors can point to and just be clear about what our expectations are. And frankly, the process of drafting the document helped us to develop to address some questions internally, because we weren't always being, like I said, even going back to the ILL question, we weren't always being consistent internally in terms of understanding what it meant to have a privacy statement. So I've been really happy with having that statement out there. I think I am very much a pro-privacy librarian, as in line with the sort of in line with what I've laid out there at the beginning. Like most librarians, I am indeed pro-privacy, but I do think it's important for us to understand what that means and understand what our expectations are. And I think it'll be good to have that discussion today and think about what kind of changes we might make as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Mimi. Over to you, Lisa.
Great, and thank you, Heather, and great to collaborate with Mimi as well here on this panel. I'm very much looking forward to our many participants challenging us and asking questions and raising observations in the chat as well, because this is really, as Mimi has already raised, an area that in some ways library practice was quite settled within the analog world, even if we maybe needed to be more attentive to our interlibrary loan records or the like, but we kind of knew how we did privacy and data protection in the analog world. And the digital transformation of the academic library has really challenged us to reinterpret, re-understand, and honestly, also the analog format wasn't changing that much anymore, whereas the digital formats are transforming across platforms on almost a daily basis, it feels like. We're very used to at the Charleston Conference, many vendor announcements about new features, new things, and of course that just continues all year long. So my personal journey on this looking at privacy in libraries in the digital age really sort of ramped up about 6 years ago at this point, when there was a number of different projects that sort of looked at this issue of privacy within the digital platform. And I had a chance to attend a number of programs around the country, conferences, but then to participate in the working group that eventually articulated the NISO privacy principles for libraries, platforms related to user data. So data in the library world, but that required this either third-party platform or provider that would be having to enact library privacy policies. Because one thing that is very unique now about the digital environment is that library privacy used to be, if you will, at least operationally under the control of the library, because it was our data, we were managing it, we were protecting it. Now we have these partners, we have hundreds of partners where our user data is on different platforms, different providers, different publishers, the ISP that people are using to connect, the campus network. There's just layer upon layer, and we really have to build these relationships so that we all have a shared understanding of what the library is expecting. But then the flip side is the library really needs to be up to date on how these technologies work so that we can understand whether we are being able to enact what we are promising our patrons. And that for me was what really brought this home for me, was attending a conference in New York City where one of the speakers spoke to the issue of liability and the issue of having what I would call aspirational statements that were masquerading as policy and practice. And the issue of sort of wanting to say, we believe in privacy, and those statements were what you would find when you would go to a library policy page on a library's website. And that was highly problematic because in most cases, our actual platforms and practices do not reflect our aspirational language, which is not to say that we should change our aspirational language, but that we need to be clear, both for, in his case, he was making the point there's like legal liability that you might not want to, incur, but also the safety of our patrons. In that if we are telling them certain spaces are private and they are not actually private, we could be endangering them, particularly when it comes to some of our more vulnerable populations, which we might consider vulnerable in any number of different ways. But of course, immigration status comes to mind. But it's also things of vulnerability due to the fact that universities do have people who are under 18 who are using our library services, all sorts of things that come into play where we need to be concerned about people's vulnerability. So really looking into this and coming to understand this, I've had, a great platform on the Scholarly Kitchen to raise a number of these issues, particularly the library community's concerns related to the original plans for RA21, which I do want to give credit to the NISO group that has taken that feedback and made a number of improvements as RA21 morphed into the Seamless Access Initiative. There's still a number of concerns I have there, and I'm happy to be working with the Contract Language Working Group on some of these issues. So at least we're in the conversations again. Similar issues coming up with GetFTR, with Google CASA, with syndication-based entitlements, various platforms now joining the identity federations like In Common in the US, but of course there are ones in other countries. And so really my attention is very much on this third-party digital platform. Nonetheless, I think as Mimi has already raised, in one realm of our traditional library practices, circulation, interlibrary loan, I think another thing that I'm sort of reflecting on is as libraries move into some new roles, like the library as publisher, and that would include for me all of our work in scholarly communications related to institutional repositories. I see libraries adopting some of these practices that look an awful lot like the ones that we're objecting to in the third-party providers. And so I think we really need to interrogate our own practices as well to make sure that we ourselves are living up to the standards that we are wanting to put out in the world, which is not to say that some of those practices might not be defensible, but I think we need to be very clear that we're doing them intentionally and not accidentally, because so many of these platforms have a kind of surveillance built into them that we might not even want that surveillance, but we might not be recognizing we have to actually shut it off, because the default in almost all platforms now is to surveil and to track anyone who is using. And so while historically we might have thought our default was no tracking unless you turn it on, we are now in an environment in which one must assume tracking is happening unless you turn it off. And so as providers of publishing services and the like, that's something we really need to be aware of. The other piece we need to be aware of is what we do with data we do have. Library circulation records, when they were on little cards, was secured in one way. It's been shown time and time again that our library systems, for example, that are used in integrated library systems are not as secure as we used to make those physical cards. But there's a lot of other data that libraries have that we do not have a good data audit. We are not aware always of the data we do have. And then we certainly do not have the kinds of security practices that probably would reflect best practices as far as controlling access to that data, auditing access to that data, data destruction, all sorts of things like that. So as much as I'm very kind of outwardly focused on those relationships with third parties, I think there's a lot of reflection that we need to do on our own practices locally to ensure that we are ourselves aspiring to the same standards we would like to see across the field.
Thank you both. I think that really helps to set the stage. I just have a couple questions because I see that we already got some folks reading Unpathable. So I'm very excited about that. Mimi, you mentioned in your opening statement the Stanford Library's project statement on patron privacy and database access. I'm wondering if you can tell us, since you've been coexisting with that policy for a while, how do things sit now? What have some of the challenges been to implementing that? And
so, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I think we're still happy to have the policy statement out there, and it is still something that we turn to when we are working with database vendors and when we are thinking about what we need and require for the, and in terms of privacy requirements in our contracts. And there were some real world examples of benefits that came out of that. I mean, it is now, we discovered pretty quickly that we had vendors who regularly were allowed to change their own privacy policies without notifying us. So that's the kind of thing that when we're looking at contracts, we now are very much aware of. We need to at least be notified if the vendor's own privacy policy is changed. And we are always, and we don't like to have references out to things that are posted on the web. We want to make sure we're building language into contracts. So there's been some real world benefits that have come out of that, and just in terms of basic practice of contracting. There were some real world challenges that came out of it as well. And customization is the thing that comes up front. We know we have a number of services that we're making available to our patrons where, in order to be able to do the kind of customization that people want, or to retain their, to create a bibliography list or any of these kind of basic, kind of central responsibilities require some kind of user identification. So we have established practices around the fact that we always, that has to be an opt-in. This goes back to, Lisa talked about opt-in versus opt-out. We are careful about ensuring that if users, it may be that users have an option to provide more data and do some customization, but we want to make sure that's an opt-in. It's not something where we're just going to pass user information and user data along to vendors in a without having them be aware of the fact that this question was going forward. Even there, it has raised some questions because we have some of these databases that are difficult to use unless you do go ahead and do that kind of customization. And we've wrestled with questions of, well, if a faculty member is going to require this to be used for a class, which we know is going to happen, or do people really have a choice, and how much choice is there? But we still wrestle with that one, but at least ensuring that we make sure that folks know what data they're sharing has been an important step. And it really also has helped us, I mentioned this before, but it really has helped us just in terms of working with vendors, having vendors know that we are, where our concerns are and what our concerns are in terms of privacy, and having that placed somewhere publicly has really helped us have the conversation. But it certainly hasn't been without its bumps in the road.
Yeah, and quick follow up there, Mimi, from the audience. Tim Lloyd was wondering, how did you deal with those vendors that thought they could unilaterally change their policies? Did you just put up with it, or did you push back, or what did you do? No,
we pushed back. And we, in the two instances that drove us that inspired us to get started on posting the policy, we were able to get to a place where we were able to make effective changes. In one case, it meant that we had to continue using an older version of a platform. We just basically didn't accept a revision of a platform, and there was a little bit of back and forth about that, but we were able to work things out. I see that there's a question about sharing the statement, and I will definitely put a link to the statement in the chat in a minute.
Great. Thanks everyone for the questions coming in. I have one more question for Lisa, and then we'll pull some more questions in from the audience. Lisa, you mentioned a couple of grants that you're working on. I hope you can give us a little bit more detail. And also there's some chatter in the chat about the Data Doubles project, which I know is something that you're familiar with. So if you could just give us a little rundown on some of those things, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So I think particularly relevant to what Mimi just mentioned, I'll start with the Melon grant that I have right now, which is looking at the whole issue of how libraries can use their purchasing contracts and the like in order to leverage the kind of privacy protections we are interested in for our library user data, but also the ways those might, touch on other relations with data security and the like. So there's a Melon grant working on some contract language, as well as some tools for, even if you have contract language, how do you get it into your contract? because there's actually, it turns out, a fair amount of language out there, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily used. And this is also a changing landscape with now these transformative agreements. And one thing we haven't really even started to talk about is what kind of data protections are we expecting for our authors when they're going through these transformative agreement data processes. I mean, maybe we are, maybe we're not. I'm not sure, like, how we haven't really even started to talk about how does privacy adhere to this kind of author services that libraries are now enabling with publishers. I mean, obviously the ultimate publication is open, right? But all that data along the way.
The publication and the other place where things come up is around just data and data sets, and the fact that most of them are covered by some kind of data use agreement, and how we're managing data use agreements in line with privacy policies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just kind of like, you peel back one layer of the onion, and then you're like, oh, there's like 6 onions inside of here. And so that is just getting underway. And more on the outcomes of that Melon grant. It was definitely pandemic disrupted, as I now uses my little code. The other project I have is with Kyle Jones at Indiana University of Indiana, Purdue University at Indiana, IUPUI. I know they don't like the acronym, but it's all I can remember. Looking at a project we have called Prioritizing Privacy, which is a capacity building professional training program for librarians who are engaged in learning analytics projects on their campus, where library data might be part of the campus data store, and looking at the ways that students are or are not successful in completing their degrees and succeeding in their classes. We, of course, also want to see those same privacy protections happening with all of that student data, but particularly the library data. But librarians have increasingly said they know what they're committed to, but they don't know how to engage that argument on the campus level with the privacy. And so the training that Kyle and I are developing is intended to help librarians develop the skill set to participate in those conversations and prioritize privacy. Also pandemic disrupted, because the curriculum was supposed to be developed in person, as workshops adjacent to physical in-person conferences. So we are now developing an online version of Prioritizing Privacy, which we hope to begin delivering in 2021. So we're really grateful to Melon for the first, IMLS for the second, with Kyle. Kyle is the lead PI on the Data Doubles project, and I am not a member of that research team, but I am aware of that project very much because of it. So in the Data Doubles project, and if anyone here attending the session is part of that team, I welcome them, filling this out and correcting as well. They are getting the student perspective on data and privacy. Because if you listen to the dialogue and read the literature on learning analytics and the like, the student voice is very absent. And in reality, it's easy to say, oh, kids these days, they don't care about their privacy, because we're observing certain behaviors. It turns out we don't actually have a whole lot of choice in many cases about how we protect our own privacy. If you think about yourself, like, try and fight with Facebook about what it will and will not share with you. I hate to even say it, but we're using a Zoom platform right now, and I will assure you there's a lot of analytics being kept about what's happening on the Zoom platform right now. So it's happening across all of higher ed and ancillary industries. So it turns out what Data Doubles is revealing, which I think is not surprising, is that students actually are quite mixed in their perceptions around data and privacy and security. But there's also some very interesting findings that they will be sharing out in their presentations and publications about the ways they perceive the library in that ecosystem, and the degree to which we are trusted to have some of their data, and the degrees to which they assume we have some of their data, what they assume we do with that data, what they assume we do not do with that data. So I think they've really done an amazing job with a set of interviews and focus groups with students, which then drove them into this very massive survey, which I believe maybe is like 10,000 students or something. It's a massive data set. So I understand they have their first survey paper out for review. And so we should hopefully see that published sometime soon. I am personally, for all these other projects, very interested in this because understanding what students believe we are doing is an important part as well of policy development, procedures, and the like. I also have a grant with the Humanities Research Institute, which is a small group. It's an internal to the University of Illinois grant where we're looking at privacy in the context of artificial intelligence and society and misinformation, like a lot of different things. But in the spring, we'll actually be doing a reading group that I'll be co-facilitating with an MLS student on the AI infodemic is what we're calling it. So looking at how all these issues are sort of can be looked at through an artificial intelligence and the ways that is impacting issues, say, for example, around privacy. So lots of work going on. I have a big
sounds really exciting. There's a question from Bob Boise, which touches on some of the issues that you raised there, Lisa. Is measuring student success with things like tracking student use of digital course reading list material at odds with privacy, even if the student names are anonymized to the library staff?
So, I mean, sure, I don't necessarily find it helpful to say, is this private or not? Because the issue is there's data trails is another word that you hear being left. We're leaving a data trail all day long, right? It's just happening. And so what we need to think about is whether our practices around that data are attentive to privacy, are privacy protecting, and also whether that data is secure. Mm-hmm. Who has access to it. So I can imagine library data, learning analytics data, even being identified and having very strong privacy practices around that data. I can imagine, quote unquote, de-identified data that has really horrible practices around it, such that actually the students could be re-identified. It doesn't actually take that many data points to re-identify individual people. Taking their name off of it is typically not enough. I know in my own life, if you just even think about surveys you're taking sometime where you're logging in on a computer and then you're giving your gender and your race and your age, like how many people are like that set of people, right? And me, one, especially if there's an IP address attached to it. So I personally believe that our best privacy and data protection practices assume that all of our data is always identifiable if it is not actually identified. And so we should treat all data as if it is identified, and that will put us in the best position to make sure that we are protecting students' privacy.
And just to sort of add on to that, because Lisa, you mentioned in your opening statement about the importance of working with campus, campus level IT providers, and on that front, that there is definitely, that it's definitely critical to be having those conversations, because it's not. My experience is that the campus is typically much more concerned with ensuring that the data stays within the campus environment and ensuring, they're not trying to push anonymizing and making material more accessible. It's really about ensuring that the things are locked down. Mm-hmm. And it's not unusual to find that you've got sort of, you can be working at cross purposes pretty easily. Mm-hmm. if you're not careful in that regard.
Right.
Excellent. And very timely or situationally specific question now from Christina Miskey. I don't know if other libraries are restricting access right now due to COVID, but tracking who enters the library. I see potential for library concerns. We're scanning IDs at the door, but how much of that data, might be kept? Is that something that you guys have come across, if indeed your libraries are allowing patrons in? And, has that come up as an internal discussion from your sides?
That's certainly come up for us, not even COVID related. I mean, our our access to our library is limited. You either, visitors have to register and you have to swipe your Stanford ID to get into the library. So that question of what we do with that data is a question that has come up regularly and continues to be a question that has come up. That's come up particularly as I mentioned the cameras. This is another situation where sort of when do we share that information with even folks like the campus police is an ongoing question. We have, for COVID, we've got a requirement of appointment. We've got an appointment-based system. We are letting people in, but on a very limited basis, and requires appointments. And so, yeah, we've had to agree that we're going to, purge the appointment data when things are over. But that the bigger picture question of what do you do with things like camera data and with your security camera footage and with records of who's coming into the library is an important one.
And I will say, I mean, so first of all, some libraries have always tracked who came in and out of the building. It's very common, especially at private institutions, to see that kind of tracking, but even at public institutions, particularly in large urban settings, it is, not atypical to have the building secured in such a way that there is some sort of logging happening of who is entering and exiting. So, a lot of this comes down to the data is being produced. What are you doing to manage it? You can manage that data well, you can manage it poorly. So the thing I guess I would say with COVID, obviously it has brought a public health concern into this. So if we look at the ALA policies on privacy and confidentiality, they do not actually say that a library must eliminate all data collection. What they say is that when a library collects data, it must be for the purpose of providing or improving service to users. So this is where we need to do an analysis, and I do think there's room for debate and dialogue, but one could argue that in order to provide service in the sense of the building as a service to users during a time of a public health pandemic, collecting data about who is there is an important component of providing a safe space, literally safe for public health. Mm-hmm. Now, what that doesn't mean then is that data should be kept in perpetuity forever and shared with whoever is interested in it, right? So we need to not sort of have a binary, like there's no data or it's all public and anyone can get to it, because that leads us down a path that really isn't productive or realistic. So same thing with circulation data. We do keep a record of what people have checked out when they have the book checked out, because we have decided that there is a service goal, which is to get the books back so we can loan them out to someone else. So it doesn't work perfectly to say that we can just take the physical world, practices and port them over to digital. But it does work to say, what were the operational principles by which we made these decisions? Yes, we'll keep a record of the book that is checked out when you have it checked out, because there's a service reason to ensure that it comes back and et cetera. It is also possible to collect and keep data for the purpose of improving services. And then I think the other thing that Mimi sort of mentioned on the side, but I do want to bring into this, it is possible for a library to, by default, not collect certain data, but as a service, collect it and protect it for users. So perhaps by default, we would have a system that does not keep your record of what you've checked out of the library, but it offers you the service of allowing you to enable that tracking for yourself. And so we might need to also become a little bit more nuanced, because in the analog age, we either did it for you or we didn't, right? There wasn't the ability to do this sort of opting in. Technology has enabled the idea of an opt-in if it's programmed into the system. So this is also where we need to think, again, not in a binary way, but think more creatively around, I mean, maybe we'd still want to do patron education around this issue, right? Like, here's what, if we have this record, then we have it. But for somebody who's like, yes, I understand, I'm actually okay with that. I'd rather keep my stuff I've read list with the library that I trust to protect that record, then keep it on Amazon as a wish list, which, by the way, I know a lot of faculty who do that. They just keep an Amazon wish list of everything they've read. Well, that doesn't seem particularly private to me. So, or they keep it on Mendeley or ProSite or EndNote. ProSite doesn't exist anymore, but whatever. Like, those are all third-party platforms that aren't library controlled or library managed, I guess I should say. So we could also think about making sure that patrons have a more privacy sensitive environment for certain information tasks, because if the library leaves the market, if you will, for those tasks, we leave them in having to look to a different part of the information landscape and arguably a less privacy oriented group of people providing those services.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm arguing for privacy as a competitive advantage for the library.
Yeah.
Sounds good. There are so many great questions, and with 4 minutes left, sadly, we're not going to get to all of them. But I do want to ask you, before we close here today, for your sense of the changing and evolving notions of privacy, whether that's amongst the students or whether that's amongst the faculty, whether that's your own changing and evolving position. Kind of where do you see these feelings going? I'll start with Mimi.
I think, some of this we've already talked about. I still think the library has an important role in education. Lisa mentioned it, and I think that's very much true. I think you do see user expectations, both around the ability to customize and have and store information and make reference back to past activities to be building in. But you do see a certain amount of understanding that privacy is an issue, and this is certainly something that's being discussed in the broader community. So so there are expectations there. So I think education is a place where we continue to see conversation going on. I think every time we're dealing with some kind of change in media type or format, I talked about data sets. We've really been wrestling with data use agreements and how we manage data use agreements, which are basically requiring us to capture information around who's using the data. So how are we then managing the data that we're receiving? And that has particularly been impacting the way we think about how we use and manage data within the libraries. So I think there's changing user perspectives, and I think things are kind of all over the map right now. And then I do think we're starting to see change within libraries and where we expect to be going.
Great, Lisa.
So I think the first thing is, this was a topic that we can just have on the agenda for Charleston for the next couple decades without any problem. It's going to be a lot of issues, and I see there's so much in the chat I can't wait to go back to. I see some good links in there that I want to follow as well. So I just can't say enough about such an engaged attendee group today. So thank you. Another thing that I think we are going to grapple with moving forward is, and I think very relevant to bring this up in the Charleston context, which is what will happen to reader privacy in open access. There's that quip, right? That if you're not paying the bill, you're the product. And, when readers aren't paying the bill anymore, when the library is not paying the reading bill, I'm concerned. I'm concerned already about what we see in the commercial marketplace with respect to news sites and the like. But, libraries have been leveraging their contracts as ways of protecting reader privacy, as well as advocating for a number of other important things. And, I also have a grant from Lyrasis right now to look at accessibility for people with disabilities on preprint servers. Because, this is something that libraries have used their contracts to say, no, these platforms have to be accessible for our users with disabilities. So it's another case where we've used our contracts historically for equity and care and concern for our readers. And so what will be our leverage points as we contract for open access services or publishing services? That's going to be an interesting challenge for us to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Lisa, because I also see challenges with open access around digital preservation and around counter usage statistics and things like that that are traditionally handled in the contract.
Yeah, you just go through our contracts and paragraph by paragraph, you can ask yourself,
Uh,
how's this going to work in a publishing contract?
Yep.
yeah, so we'll look forward to continuing this conversation both in the chat and in other sessions. Please join me in thanking Mimi and Lisa for their candid conversation here today. I hope it's given you food for thought. I know that it has me. And everyone enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'll be at trivia tonight. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye.
Heather.